The book of Tobit. It tells the story of an Israelite whose suffering leads him to a surprise discovery of God's mercy. The book was written around the year 200 BC, centuries after many Israelites returned from Babylonian exile to rebuild their lives. And while we don't know who the author is, it was clearly someone who knew the Hebrew scriptures inside and out. Tobit wasn't considered part of the Hebrew Bible in early Judaism or in the Jesus movement, but the book's Greek translation became popular in later Christian circles, and some of them did consider it scripture. Today, Tobit is part of the Deuterocanon in Roman Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. The book tells the story of Tobit, a faithful Israelite who lived among Israel's northern tribes when they were invaded by Assyria in 722 BC and taken into exile. But remember, the book was written centuries after all of that, when some Jews were still in exile and others were back in the land, all under foreign military occupation. And so, Tobit's past story of faithfulness, as he suffered in Assyrian exile, is here offered as an example to Israelites who suffered under later empires. Tobit's story is their story, and it was meant to give hope for the future. Here's how. After Tobit's family is relocated to the Assyrian capital city of Nineveh, Tobit became known for his integrity and generosity to the poor. So he lands a job in the royal court of Assyria. However, it's actually his faithfulness to God that brings him trouble. The king of Assyria, who's an unpredictable grouch, would often execute Israelites for no good reason. So Tobit would secretly take the bodies and give them an honorable burial. But one night, after hearing of an Israelite murdered in the town square, Tobit snuck outside to recover the body, and a bird flying overhead drops a load of poop into his eyes, and he goes blind. So here's Tobit being faithful to his God and his people, and what he gets is blindness. So he cries out in prayer. He would rather die than live blind and miserable, exiled in Nineveh, so he asks God to take his life. Suddenly, the story shifts location to the distant city of Ecbatana in Media, and we meet a distant relative of Tobit's, an exile named Sarah. She too has been faithful to God, and like Tobit, has suffered a great deal. She's been married for one day, 7 separate times. Each husband died on their wedding night from a plague caused by an evil spirit. And so Sarah offers her own prayer of lament. Instead of living in shame and fear, she asks, like Tobit, that God take her life. Through the prayers of Tobit and Sarah, the author expresses the pain of generations of exiled Israelites. But these laments also speak of God's mercy, which prepares us for what happens next. We're told that God responds to these prayers by sending an angelic messenger named Raphael, which means God heals. He will orchestrate a great reversal for Tobit and Sarah. And now this story becomes a dramatic irony. You, the reader, know that things are going to work out, but you have to keep on reading to discover how. Back to old blind Tobit, who's now living in poverty. He wants to provide for his son Tobias, and so he commissions him to go on a long journey to redeem an investment that he made decades ago. Tobit assumes that he's going to die soon, so he gives his son final words of wisdom. And he also asks that Tobias marry within the extended family. So Tobias goes out to find a guide for his journey, and who does he meet? Raphael the angel, of course, who's disguised as a relative, and he offers to help Tobias on his journey. And so, while his mother weeps to see her son go, Tobias sets out with Raphael for the adventurous journey that lay ahead. Their first night at camp, there's danger and surprise. While they're washing off in the Tigris River, a large fish tries to swallow Tobias. Sound like Jonah, right? Just as Tobit's life was ruined by an animal, this fish almost does the same to his son. But Tobias yanks the fish onto dry land, and Raphael instructs him to gut the fish and keep the innards, because this great fish that almost brought death will paradoxically become a source of life for others. From there they journey on, and Raphael informs Tobias that they're nearing Ecbatana, where his relative Sarah lives with her family. Raphael recommends that Tobias propose to marry Sarah, and Tobias is thrilled. So they find her parents, Raguel and Edna. Tobias and Sarah meet, and they immediately fall in love, and he asks for her hand in marriage. Now, this all seems wonderful, but remember, he's husband number 8. Tobias is in serious danger. So the next day they get married, and Raphael tells Tobias to burn some of the fish guts in their wedding tent that night, kind of a weird and smelly way to celebrate, and he tells them to pray to God for deliverance from the evil spirit. Tobias and Sarah do all of this, and Tobias wakes up in the morning alive. Sarah's tragic plight has been reversed. They can start a family together. Now, when Sarah's father Raguel hears about this, he offers prayers of thanks to God. And notice, Sarah's lament poem earlier in the book is now matched by this poem of praise for God's mercy. And if Sarah's plight has been reversed, that means there's hope for Tobit back at home. But for the moment, Sarah's family sponsors a 14-day wedding party to celebrate. And while Tobias parties, he sends Raphael to go and redeem his father's investment, so that when the party's over, they can journey back home. Now, back in Nineveh, Tobias's parents are freaking out about his long absence. The journey should have taken a week, but it's been well over 2. Tobias's weeping mother is certain that her son is dead, but then one day, Tobias arrives. He greets his mother and rushes into town to see his blind father. Raphael instructs Tobias to smear the remaining fish guts on his father's eyes, and Tobit is healed of his blindness. And so in a single day, Tobit's years of suffering are reversed. He regains his sight, his son, and he meets Sarah, his new daughter. After this, the reunited family finds Raphael to repay him, and he reveals his true identity as God's messenger. Raphael urges them to thank God for his mercy, and then he disappears. That's when Tobit breaks out in the longest poem in the story. It's a song of praise that retells the story of his exile and suffering, and of his humility before the merciful God who brought about his restoration. Then suddenly, the time perspective of the poem shifts, and events that are yet future for Tobit, like the downfall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile, they're spoken of as if they're in the past. Here, Tobit's voice has merged with the author's later voice, and so Tobit's prayer can now express the hopes of later generations still suffering under foreign oppression. The prayer is that a new Jerusalem be rebuilt by a restored Israel, where God's glory can fill a new temple and all nations be drawn together in God's blessing and peace and kingdom. Essentially, Tobit's praying for the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham and David that you read about in the biblical prophets. The author and his generation joined Tobit in patiently waiting for this great hope. The book concludes with Tobit on his deathbed, warning Tobias to leave Nineveh because of the biblical prophet Nahum, who warned that the city would be overthrown. So Tobias and his family, they flee to Sarah's parents in Media, and Nahum's words are fulfilled as Babylon topples Assyria. Tobias praises God for fulfilling the first stage of his promises, and then he dies in exile. And that's how the book ends, still waiting for God's mercy to finish what he started. The book of Tobit is a profound expression of biblical hope in the face of exile and suffering. Notice how most of the book is patterned after earlier biblical stories of faithful Israelites living in a foreign land. The sojourners Abraham and Isaac, who urged their children to marry within the family. Daniel's faithfulness and suffering in Babylonian exile. Jacob's loss and recovery of his beloved son Joseph that leads them to Egypt. And the many prayers in the book are modeled after poems in the book of Psalms and Deuteronomy. Tobit's story was written for all generations of God's people, living abroad in exile or back in the land under foreign oppressors. Tobit maintained hope in God's promise despite his hardship, and he lived for the day that God's kingdom would come here on earth as it is in heaven. And that's what the book of Tobit is all about.